right. Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a couple seconds here just to get everybody in the room and give them time to join the webinar. Okay, so it's 1:01. We will go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, GRAS versus NDI, Choosing the Right Pathway for U.S. Market Entry. My name is Bryana Hallam, and I will be your presenter today. I am a senior regulatory specialist at Quality Smart Solutions, where I support clients with projects like GRAS determinations, NDI notifications, and other ingredient safety dossiers. So today we will be walking through one of the most common and often confusing regulatory decision points in the US market, and that is choosing between a GRAS or a NDIN. Whether you are developing a new ingredient, expanding into new product formats, or reassessing your regulatory strategy, choosing between a GRAS or an NDI has significant implications for your product timeline, your data requirements, and even your commercialization strategy. So today's session, we will cover definitions, overviews of each pathway, regulatory expectations, the standards for evidence for both pathways, and then we will finish with a decision framework that you can apply immediately to make this decision. So let's begin with GRAS, what it means, how it works, and who determines it. So GRAS stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. It's a regulatory classification under the U.S. Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and that applies to substances intentionally added to conventional foods and beverages. So the key concept behind GRAS is that the ingredient is considered safe by qualified experts under its intended conditions of use. And so now there are two ways to achieve GRAS status. The first is through what is called scientific procedures. This is the pathway that's used for most modern ingredients. It relies on robust, publicly available safety data such as toxicology studies, human clinical data, as well as exposure assessments to determine a GRAS conclusion. The second pathway applies to ingredients with a history of use prior to January 1st, 1958, and this is also called the common use in food pathway. These are considered grandfathered ingredients and rely on documented and widespread consumption in the food supply. So it's important to emphasize here that the GRAS pathways are specifically for conventional foods and not for ingredients intended for dietary supplements. So who makes the GRAS determination? Traditionally, companies have had two options. The first is self-determination or self-affirmed. So in this scenario, a company would assemble their own panel of qualified experts. So often these are toxicologists, clinicians, or food safety experts who then review the data and conclude whether or not the ingredient is GRAS or not. Self-affirmed has been widely used in the industry because it allows for flexibility and avoids FDA review timelines. It's important to note here that self-affirmed GRAS requires the same level of evidence and supporting documentation as a FDA-notified GRAS determination. So self-affirmation does not reduce the evidence requirements for determining safety. Now, the FDA is actively moving toward eliminating this pathway, and we'll discuss more on that shortly. And so the second option here is the FDA notification or FDA-affirmed. So here, a GRAS notification or a GRAS notice is submitted to the FDA, who will then evaluate the submission and provide a response. The best case outcome is a no questions letter, which means that the FDA has no objection or no questions to your GRAS conclusion. And so now, why does this matter? So in the US, it's required for market access and also for consumer trust. So it supports transparency and also compliance within the FDA GRAS program. It's recognized as a separate category from food additives while still requiring the same level of safety evidence. So now we will talk about some of the key features of a GRAS. The first is that an FDA submitted GRAS dossier is not an FDA approval. I think this is a large misconception in the industry. So when you receive a no questions letter, it essentially means that the FDA has no objection or no questions to your conclusion that your ingredient is GRAS. So it's more of a scientific conclusion rather than an official approval, but it still provides regulatory credibility. Second, it relies heavily on publicly available data. So here, transparency is mandatory. And this is based off of the common knowledge element of a GRAS conclusion, which is a major distinction from an NDI. And third, GRAS status is tied to the specific ingredient, use level, and food categories. So the intended use has to be explicitly stated, and this would be food categories such as dairy products, bakery items, protein powders, among many others. Now, if the intended use or the serving levels change, then a separate assessment would be required for reconfirming its GRAS status. A GRAS dossier incorporates the ingredient's identity, information on the manufacturing process, and it also takes into account toxicity data on either the ingredient or similar ingredients to establish safety. Now, because GRAS focuses on food use, this means that the evaluation is not just about the ingredient itself, but it's about how it will be used and consumed in food. So, for example, what food categories will it be used in? How much will people consume of those food categories? And what does the total dietary exposure of the ingredient from its consumption look like? So this is where dietary consumption data is required. So GRAS is fundamentally a population-based assessment and not just a product-based one. So now let's shift to NDIs. We'll go over the NDI process briefly here. NDI stands for New Dietary Ingredient, and it applies specifically to dietary supplements. They are regulated under the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. An NDI is any ingredient that was not marketed in the US before October 15th, 1994. So this includes vitamins, minerals, botanicals, amino acids, just to list some examples here. If your ingredient is new or is being marketed after October 15th, 1994, you typically are required to submit an NDI notification or an NDIN to the FDA at least 75 days before marketing. So the FDA will review the submission and respond in one of three ways, either with a no objection letter, an objection letter, or they may indicate that there are deficiencies with the submission. In practice, many NDIs receive objections, not necessarily because they are unsafe, but because the submission did not adequately demonstrate safety. So this could be due to potentially gaps in identity, toxicity data, or manufacturing details. So now we'll just look at a side-by-side comparison. So GRAS and NDIs differ in several important ways. First, of course, is the product category, as I mentioned. So GRAS applies specifically to conventional foods and beverages, while NDIs are for dietary supplements. Submission to the FDA is completely voluntary for GRAS. However, notification may become mandatory with recent proposed GRAS reforms in the US. And then meanwhile, submission for NDIs is required at least 75 days before marketing, unless that ingredient qualifies for an exemption, which I'll get into later. In terms of data requirements, GRAS relies on publicly available information and expert consensus, while NDIs allow for proprietary data to be used. An exposure assessment is a large part of determining the GRAS status of an ingredient. So a dietary exposure assessment is carried out to support the safe use of the ingredient based on its intended use in GRAS. Now, with NDIs, the focus is much more targeted. The safety justification must directly support that intended dose and serving level in the intended population. And now quickly just looking at confidentiality. GRAS, if you go through the FDA-affirmed pathway, your submission will be made publicly available. While the FDA does allow for limited redactions in the dossier, they ultimately determine what information can remain confidential. And in contrast, for NDIs, the notification to FDA is also made public. However, with NDIs, the confidential information can be redacted at the notifier's request. And we'll go over each of these elements in more detail shortly. In the US, there are a few exceptions to submitting an NDIN, as I mentioned. The first is that the ingredient is an old dietary ingredient, meaning that it has evidence of its use before 1994. And the second is that if the ingredient is already GRAS and present in the food supply. So if the ingredient is already GRAS, this is what's known as the GRAS loophole. This loophole essentially reduces redundancy of FDA review for an ingredient's use in food without having to review a completely separate application for its use in dietary supplements. This refers to the idea that if an ingredient is GRAS for food, it can be used in supplements without submitting an NDIN. And over time, this really became a method of introducing bioactive substances into dietary supplements without having to go through the whole pre-market approval process for an NDI. But in reality, this is not clearly defined or consistently enforced. It's also not a substitute for an NDI, and it also doesn't replace NDI obligations for dietary supplements. So, for example, the GMP requirements differ between conventional foods and dietary supplements, with the dietary supplement GMPs listed in CFR Part 111 being overall more stringent. Now, the key takeaway here is that GRAS does not automatically cover dietary supplement use. These are separate regulatory pathways, and relying on this framework can introduce significant regulatory risk. So now we'll talk about the evidence standards, intake assessments, and transparency rules for both GRAS and NDI pathways. Now, how each pathway handles public disclosure and proprietary data is fundamentally different. This is often a major strategic factor when choosing between a GRAS or an NDI. Now, starting with GRAS, if you go through the FDA-affirmed pathway, your submission will be made publicly available in the GRAS notice inventory. The FDA may allow some information to be redacted, but as I mentioned before, it really depends, and it's ultimately It's the FDA that makes the final decision on what can be withheld from disclosure. So there is a significant level of transparency associated with this pathway. If we look at self-affirmed GRAS, historically this has allowed for a bit more flexibility. The dossier in this case is not published, but the main recommendation is that the GRAS expert panel report be publicly available. So this is not the whole dossier, but it's rather just a summary report of the dossier and the expert panel conclusions. Now, although proprietary data like unpublished studies can remain confidential in a self-GRAS, they are still typically shared with the expert panel to help them arrive at a GRAS conclusion. So this does mean that there is significant IP risk for theft in the self-affirmed and FDA-affirmed GRAS conclusion pathways. So now if you compare that to NDIs, for NDIs, the submitted notification to FDA and the FDA's response is also made publicly available. However, in contrast, companies can request redactions to their notification. So this means that sensitive information, like manufacturing details or proprietary data, can be protected from public disclosure as confidential commercial information, or CCI. So in practice, NDIs do offer a higher level of confidentiality compared to GRAS, especially when it comes to protecting intellectual property. Overall, GRAS, and particularly FDA-notified GRAS, comes with greater transparency, while NDIs provide more control over confidential business information. And for many companies, this really can be a deciding factor in choosing the regulatory pathway to take. One of the most important concepts is the difference in the required evidence between a GRAS and an NDI. GRAS requires general recognition of safety. So this means that the data must be publicly available and widely accepted. This really is one of the biggest strategic constraints for companies, as confidential data is not sufficient on its own because there needs to be general recognition of safety requiring common knowledge about the ingredient. So this is generally demonstrated in or through publication in peer-reviewed scientific journals. While NDIs require a reasonable expectation of safety, this allows for proprietary data and a more targeted argument, which is a major advantage of NDIs, where companies can rely on unpublished toxicology studies or internal research to support safety. Now, neither evidence standard is necessarily easier, but they are different. GRAS is about consensus among qualified experts with general recognition, and NDIs are about sufficiency of the data to support its safe use. Now we'll look at exposure or dietary intakes assessments, which is another major difference between the two pathways. GRAS looks at total exposure across foods. It uses US dietary food consumption data to estimate exposure to an ingredient based on its intended food uses. For example, we can use food consumption data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, also known as NHANES. The NHANES data can be used to derive an estimated daily intake or an EDI for the ingredient, and this estimates how much of it will be consumed daily. The EDI is compared to a maximum intake level to then conclude safety, while NDIs take a more targeted approach. So instead of looking at total dietary exposure and using population-wide exposure modeling like in GRAS, we're really focusing on the specific way that the ingredient will be consumed in a dietary supplement. The assessment is centered on the intended supplement use, which makes it more streamlined, but it also is more dependent on your specific product positioning. In an NDI, first, the intended intake levels are defined. So this includes both the amount per serving and the maximum daily dose. These values are crucial because your entire safety argument needs to support that proposed level of exposure. And then we'll look at the duration of use. So is this something that will be taken occasionally, or is it intended for long-term or daily use? Chronic exposure typically requires a more robust safety data set. And finally, and most importantly, the proposed serving level must be supported by safety data. So that usually includes toxicology studies and sometimes human data to establish a clear margin of safety that is relative to a known reference point or maximum level, like a no observed adverse effect level or a NOAL. So in an NDI, a well-described safety narrative and data package should support the serving level and safe consumption of that NDI. Now we'll highlight some of the most common mistakes that we see when companies are navigating between a GRAS and an NDI, because these can significantly delay development or create regulatory risk with product implementation. The first and probably the most frequent is assuming that the food use automatically translates to supplement safety. Just because an ingredient is considered safe in food under GRAS does not mean that it is automatically safe at supplement doses. Supplements often involve higher and more concentrated intake levels, which may actually exceed what was evaluated as safe under the GRAS conclusion. So, especially for dual use ingredients, it is important to remember that your GRAS exposure level essentially sets a ceiling, and realistically, you can't exceed that when positioning the ingredient for dietary supplements without additional safety justification. Another common issue is ignoring changes in manufacturing. Even small changes in the process, like extraction methods, solvents, or purity, this can alter the identity and therefore the safety profile of an ingredient. Now, from a regulatory perspective, that can essentially create a whole new ingredient that requires reassessment. We also often see over-reliance on the wrong type of data. For example, using short-term or acute human studies to support ingredients' intended use for long-term or daily consumption. Regulators are really looking for data that actually aligns with how the ingredient will be used. So study design and duration need to match your intended conditions of use. Another error is misaligned specifications, where the product specifications that are used in testing don't actually match what is being commercialized. So this creates gaps in the safety narrative and can therefore trigger questions from the FDA. And finally, a big one, of course, is trying to retrofit GRAS data into an NDI submission late in development. These pathways are built on different assumptions. So GRAS is population-based and relies on public data, while an NDI is dose-specific and can use proprietary data to support safety. Now, trying to force one data set into the other framework at the last minute often leads to deficiencies or objections from the FDA. So the overall key theme here is all about alignment, making sure your data, your manufacturing, and your intended use are all consistent with the regulatory pathway that you've chosen. Next, we will talk about the upcoming and pending GRAS changes and some next steps for ingredient manufacturers and companies. Even before regulatory changes and reform, self-GRAS has carried some regulatory risks. These self-determinations can often be challenged by the FDA, retailers, attorneys, and NGOs. And common weaknesses include just poor exposure estimates, old or outdated toxicology data, and a narrow intended use, which all contribute to a weak safety narrative, which then overall increases regulatory vulnerability. Now, this brings us to one of the biggest upcoming changes in the US. The FDA is proposing to eliminate the self-affirmed GRAS pathway. Now, this means that in the future, all GRAS determinations may need to be submitted to the FDA and receive a no questions letter before marketing. Now, the intent here is to increase transparency and ensure that the FDA is aware of all ingredients entering the US food supply. We expect a proposed rule this year with a draft final rule anticipated for 2027 to 2028 and potential enforcement closer to 2029. So for industry, this does mean that there will be increased regulatory burden and longer timelines for FDA review. If you are relying on self-GRAS, it is important to start thinking about your future strategy. And that, of course, means preparing for increased scrutiny. And it's why taking a proactive approach is key. So you'll want to review any existing GRAS positions where you identify high-risk ingredients that may be GRAS based on weak safety data or have a narrow intended use. You may also want to reevaluate your dossier strength and update toxicology and allergenicity sections, manufacturing information, as well as product specifications and impurity assessments. You should also be reviewing supplier documentation and ensure that you have access to full safety data packages. Now, you may also want to consider a voluntary GRAS notification, as it does provide a stronger compliance position than a self-affirmation alone, especially if it will become mandatory within the coming years. Now, the key mindset shift here is to treat GRAS as a living compliance file and not just a one-time conclusion. If you are currently relying on a self-affirmed dossier, you could also consider preparing a public-facing safety narrative now for customers, retailers, investors, and regulators. So let's bring this together in a decision framework. The first question that can be asked is, what product category will the ingredient be marketed in? Will it be in foods, supplements, or potentially both? In many cases, particularly with dual-use ingredients, a combined strategy may actually be required, so submitting a GRAS and then an NDI. Second, how broad is the intended consumer exposure? Is it for the general population or a restricted group? General population would be more aligned with the GRAS, whereas a specific population would be better suited for an NDI. And lastly, are you prepared for public disclosure? An FDA submitted GRAS dossier is fully published to the GRAS notice inventory and, of course, is associated with less proprietary information protection, whereas information in an NDI notification can be redacted. Answering these questions should hopefully assist with determining which pathway makes the most sense for your ingredient. So this slide gives you a quick look at some of the ingredient-related services that we offer here at QSS. QSS has been around since 2007, and we work across a pretty wide range of regulatory areas, including NHP registrations in Canada, novel food applications, and other ingredient services in various jurisdictions, as well as cosmetic substantiation, medical devices, and much more. So, if you're really not sure which pathway makes sense for your ingredient or your product, that is exactly the kind of conversation that we love having. We're here and we are happy to help figure out where to start. Now, to wrap up, GRAS and NDIs are not interchangeable. They are separate, distinct regulatory pathways, and choosing the right one changes your timeline, IP protection, and of course, your commercial strategy. Choosing the right pathway requires balancing regulatory requirements, scientific evidence, and your business strategy. Regulatory expectations are increasing across both pathways, meaning that data strategy should be developed early on and not retrofitted later in development. The evolving GRAS landscape also means that there should be less reliance on self-GRAS and a proactive approach should be taken, such as submitting a voluntary GRAS notification to the FDA to prepare for potentially mandatory notification, or even reevaluating if an NDI pathway is the more suitable option for your ingredient. Your pathway choice has direct implications for time to market, investor confidence, and long-term commercialization that deserves deliberate planning. Ultimately, the best approach is one that aligns safety, compliance, as well as commercialization goals. Now, thank you for your time today. We will now move into the Q&A portion of this webinar. I have here with me Andrew Parshad from Quality Smart Solutions, who will also be answering any questions that we have.
Thanks, Bryana.
You're welcome.
All right. So first question here, can my FDA GRAS also work in other markets like Canada and Europe? The answer is kind of mixed there in that on a regulatory standpoint, it doesn't work like there is an equivalency. You can't say, oh, well, I've got FDA GRAS, so I'm considered novel automatically in Canada or in Europe. However, there is data that could be used that can be carried over in other markets, Canada, Europe, Australia, whether it's manufacturing data, stability, tox studies that are conducted that could also be repurposed in those other markets. So there is that opportunity. We've heard anecdotally that some buyers, like for example in Europe, where a novel food submission could, getting a final answer from EFSA could take many years. Some buyers say, hey, if you've got GRAS, we'll take it. Now that's not really compliant. We're not endorsing that by any means, but we've heard that anecdotally as kind of their own stopgap, and that's their own risk that they're taking. But there is some opportunity to definitely carry over some of that information over to other jurisdictions. Okay.
Okay, I can read this one. Hello, colleagues. Thank you for a great webinar. You clearly delineated the line between food, GRAS, and NDI dietary supplements regimes However, very often we see dietary supplements using self-affirmed GRAS as the regulatory route, sometimes selling their active ingredient or strain in some obscure food to 10 people. Can you dive a bit deeper into this? Andrew, did you want to answer that question?
Yeah, sometimes selling their active. I'll pass that one to you to answer if you're able to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this does come up sometimes where, yeah, like, I mean, and we went through this recently with another client where we explained, positioning in terms of a nutritional supplement, a nutritional supplement within the GRAS
Mhm.
dossier, the one pathway, but still having a grounding of intended use for food as a primary purpose.
Yeah, and like I mentioned in the webinar, there is that loophole. So even if it is a FDA affirmed GRAS or it's self GRAS, if it is present in the food supply, it does qualify as a dietary supplement, but it does carry a lot of regulatory risk, especially in terms of safety and dosing. So we do see dietary supplements are at higher concentrations or higher dosing that may not have been supported in a GRAS dossier that is only looking at food consumption. So there is a significant amount of risk that that company would be taking.
All right. How can I save on costs with a GRAS dossier? So, for those of you who are familiar with going through a GRAS or a novel food submission, there's, it's an investment, not just in terms of preparing the GRAS dossier and going through that whole journey, but also other requirements with a GRAS or novel food pathway, and that could include toxicity studies and or human clinical data that is used to support your GRAS dossier. So one of the things that is part of a self-affirmed GRAS dossier often is used is an expert panel, and that expert panel validates what the the company, the consultant, or if the company themselves prepared that dossier, it validates what their conclusion was. And so it's often used. It's not mandatory in terms of, like the FDA doesn't say, hey, you have to have an expert panel. It's the expectation is that you should be having, qualified individuals who have prepared that dossier to substantiate its safety. So that's an area where there could be some cost savings. We typically don't advise to, if you're staying self-affirmed, that you not have an expert panel, because it is a validation of your dossier. But when you submit it to the FDA is essentially you could say your panel to determine a no questions letter and NQL in the end. They're the ones who are going to review that dossier. The FDA has outlined also best practices for the use of an expert panel, but again, that's not an endorsement of them indicating that you must have an expert panel. When you're submitting to FDA. So that's one way. Of course, another way is those studies that you conduct. Doing studies in other countries such as in India or in China, making sure that, of course, they meet the qualifications that the FDA is looking for, OECD, GLP, could save you costs as well, compared to maybe doing a similar animal study, for example, in the United States or in Europe. There are other parts in Europe too than the main centers that you could find ways to save costs. So those are just two ways to consider. But at the end of the day, shouldn't be necessarily looking at finding ways to really make this as cheap as possible. It is an investment. And at the end of the day, you know, it's a really valuable tool to use when you're facing buyers, because more and more buyers are asking for either the NDI, stated in the public forum on the register, in the Federal Register, or they're looking for an NQL from FDA, particularly with potential changes that are happening, that could be happening very soon here with the self-affirmation changes. So really go in this with a solid business plan and an understanding that it's about a return on investment of proving that you are safe. And it is the law, whether it's self-affirmed, GRAS notice, or NDI, you have to prove its safety. Of course, based on those qualifications that Bryana had mentioned earlier, in terms of whether it's grandfathered in 1994 with NDIN, 1958 with GRAS, and meeting all those qualifications to be considered grandfathered. So.
Okay. Yeah, I can read this one. Is GRAS or NDIN enough to sell in the US market, or are there other requirements?
Yeah, so if you are a foreign company, that means a company outside the United States, and you're going to be, obtaining GRAS or NDIN, and then you're going to be starting to export that ingredient to the United States. Beyond one of those two pathways, you have to make sure that your manufacturing facility is registered with the FDA. You also need to have a U.S. agent associated with that registered facility. And secondly, you need an FSVP agent, which stands for Foreign Supplier Verification Program agent, to verify the ingredient supplier, manufacturer, to make sure that they're following GMP or they have a food safety plan. Those are mandatory as per FSMA for FSVP. FSMA is the Food Safety Modernization Act in the United States. Quality Smart Solutions offers both of those solutions. We can register your facility. We can also act as your FSVP agent. So those are two in particular that are required for any ingredient, any food or dietary supplement ingredient entering the United States. So FSVP is not required if it's domestically made, if it's made in the United States. A facility, though, that is manufacturing ingredients does have to be registered with the FDA as well. So, but no U.S. agent is required. It's only required for foreign manufacturer sites. Any other questions? So we covered a lot today, GRAS, NDIN. Our team is here to help you, Bryana, as well as others on the ingredient compliance team. We're very knowledgeable. Reach out to us. We'd be happy to build a strategy for you, determining which pathway is the best pathway for you, and also consider, if you're considering multiple markets, whether it's just United States or Canada, Europe, Australia, the Asia Pacific region. Another strategy to consider is kind of a multi-jurisdictional evaluation. So that's something that we can also help you with. These changes that are potentially happening here in the United States with self-affirmed GRAS. Something that you should also consider is, that timeline could be 2029, 2030, when it comes into full enforcement. That isn't a lot of time. It may seem like it on a calendar, but when it comes to going through this whole process, and especially after you go through a gap assessment, if there are certain studies that you need to conduct, those studies can take 6 to 10 months, and then you have to go through all that. So, and then after that, preparing the dossier and And then if you submit it to the FDA, that could take, 6 to 18 plus months. And considering that the FDA's resources have been reduced, and that happened last year, we don't know if the FDA is going to be increasing those resources again. And that in itself could create a bottleneck, which could result in longer wait times before the final conclusion is made. So work all that timeline backwards. 3 years isn't a lot of time, so something to consider. Now, we've also seen other states, New York State, California in particular, have introduced similar kind of legislations. They're even proposing a potential listing of self-affirmed GRAS dossiers and a public list that would be applicable to those states. So some of these states are getting proactive. And it's not surprising that California is doing this, because California has always been kind of ahead of the curve, Proposition 65 and whatnot. So there's a lot of developments in various states, and I don't think those are the only 2 states. And they kind of want to get ahead of this to allow for ingredients to be sold in those states. Now, obviously, there's a federal jurisdiction and there's a state jurisdiction, and really, the federal jurisdiction wins. So you really, obviously be in tune with that. We're always keeping our ear to the ground about these other jurisdictions, and so we'll, follow our pages and you'll see more information along those lines. But really, the word is GRAS and or NDIN, and really buyers these days, they're they've been open to self-GRAS and or a GRAS notice, and that's kind of the quote unquote buzzword that they hear, and that often comes from higher up in management from these companies buying these materials. And now the shift has been more towards full GRAS, not just self-GRAS, and they're just getting ahead of. They don't want to be caught buying an ingredient that they may feel that suddenly the FDA is like, oh, that self-affirmed is not allowed. And they may not know the full scope of it. They just know certain words. And GRAS seems to be a more prevalent word out there amongst buyers than NDIN is. And that's where we often see a lot of companies who maybe their purpose is really only for dietary supplements, but they want to get GRAS. And we have to educate them and help them make the right decision. And see if GRAS is actually viable for them, or actually they have to go through an NDI dossier submission. So there's just some things to kind of consider in terms of a commercial strategy with your ingredient. So.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for that insight. I hope the webinar and the Q&A session was incredibly helpful for everybody. I think we can see if there are any more questions, but it doesn't look like there are.
Oh, there's one that just popped up here. Okay, great presentation. Thank you. Thanks, Bryana.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. So on that note, thank you everybody for joining. And if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, Andrew or myself. And yeah, I hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.